Good evening. This is Joe Gallo of AnCan. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar. We'll get into that momentarily, but I'd like to just make a couple early administrative comments. First, I ask everyone to please remain on mute and not share your webcam so that we don't have any other distractions. The Q&As are going to be available. You can start putting questions into the Q&A box at any time throughout the presentation. They will be consolidated by the moderators and then presented to our guests. If you can now see on your screen, we'd just like you to know that the information opinions expressed in the presentation are not intended to be recommendations by AnCan or its representatives for any medical treatment, product, or course of action. That includes our presenters. They're not here as medical advisors. You should always conduct your doctor for a specific situation before pursuing any health program or treatment. And now what I'd like to do is introduce to you Rick Davis, our founder and leader of the AnCan, who will make his opening comments.
Welcome, everybody. This is a very exciting moment right now because we are about to hopefully finally decide whether a Gleason 3 prostate 3 is actually cancer or not cancer. And interestingly enough, these discussions have been coming up all over the place, including in our low intermediate group, and even today in our I was dealing with this with a man who has recurrent metastatic cancer. So it is of interest to a lot of people, and we are delighted to have Dr. Zhou and Dr. Eggener. Just a quick word of thanks to our sponsors. That's Myovant, Pfizer, Foundation Medicine, and Novartis Advanced Accelerator Applications. And also a big thank you to those who helped us publicize this webinar, namely Zero, PCI, ASPE, and Prostate Cancer Support in Canada. And with that, I'll hand it over, I believe, to Howard, who's going to make the introductions.
When I was first, I'm Howard Walensky, and I'm one of the moderators of this group. And when I was first diagnosed with Gleason 6 prostate cancer, I only heard one word. As you may guess, it was cancer. It was a shock. And even more shocking is that as I've learned more about this condition, I discovered there has been an ongoing debate on whether Gleason 6 is actually a cancer. Pathologists see cancer when they review biopsy slides. They recognize Gleason 6 as a cancer. It looks like a cancer, so it's a cancer. Some urologists who are treating the patients see a lazy, slow-growing, quote, cancer and wonder if it should be redefined as non-cancerous. Tonight, we'll hear a debate on the question, is Gleason 6 really a cancer? We'll be hearing from two leaders in their respective fields, Dr. Ming Zhou, Pathologist-in-Chief and Chairman of Anatomic and Clinical Pathology at Tufts Medical Center in Boston, who will be on the affirmative. And on the other side is Dr. Scott Eggener, Vice Chair of Urology at the University of Chicago, who will argue the negative. And just for the record, Dr. Eggener is spearheading a movement to reclassify Gleason 6. So before we begin, we kind of want to know something about you, and we want to know what your Gleason score is. So if you can fill that in quickly.
Okay, we should have that.
So Joe, do you want to read it off?
I'm going to try to make sure this will display for me. Okay, there are our results. We have 78% of the current audience is a 6, 16% are a 7, and we have some 8, 9, and 10 visitors with us as well, with 6%.
Okay, and then we have one other quick poll on on what you think of Gleason 6 now. Is it a cancer? So Joe, if you can put that poll up, and then we'll get on with the business.
It's fighting with me. Here we go.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's coming in fast. Okay, the polls have closed.
And let's get to display. There we go. 55% say yes, 10% say no, and 35% are unsure.
Okay,
Probably
so
why most of us are here.
So let's try, Joe, will we be able to keep a record of that? Because we're going to do a follow-up poll too. But
Yes, we will.
So why don't we get going without much ado? And Dr. Zhou, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. I'm glad that 52% of the audience thinks it is the Gleason 6 is cancer. That's also my position. That is, Gleason 6 is really a cancer. So this is what I'm going to do tonight, because there has been many debates and discussions on this topic, whether a Gleason score 6 is cancer, and therefore a lengthy discussions of the evidences will be out of the scope, beyond the scope of our debate tonight. Instead, I'm going to focus on the new evidence that has emerged recently. At the end of the debate, I really hope that we'll agree that we need to shift the debate from the label, cancer versus non-cancer, to better risk stratifications for Gleason 6 cancer. So first, let's look at what is cancer and whether Gleason 6 prostate tumor fits the cancer definition. The cancer has many different definitions, but in essence, cancer is the uncontrolled growth of abnormal cells in a part of the body, which will cause local invasive and destructive growth, distant metastases, and death if not treated. So the question is, does Gleason 6 tumor fit this definition? Well, morphologically, Gleason 6 is cancer because just like any prostate cancer with different grades, Gleason 6 tumor has lost basal cells. Cytologically and architecturally, Gleason 6 tumor is indistinguishable from higher grade cancer as well. And Gleason 6 and high grade cancers often merge with each other in the same tumor. And it also can cause local invasive growth, including perineal invasion, extraprostatic extension. This is an example of perineal invasion. You can see these Gleason 6 cancer glands invade and wrap around the nerve, which is in the center of this view. Again, perineum invasion is a characteristic feature of prostate cancer and does not happen with benign. This is an example of seminal vascular invasion, and you can see this seminal vascular tissue in the upper half of the screen, and these are Gleason 6 cancer that invades into the wall of the seminal vascular. And again, the seminal vascular invasion is a characteristic feature of prostate cancer and doesn't happen with benign glands. Gleason 6 tumors also exist on a molecular continuum with higher Gleason cancers. Many studies have shown that Gleason 6 and higher grade cancer share genetic changes. Here, I'm showing you one study by Barker et al. That studied 57 prostate tumors and found that there is a similar extent of somatic genomic alterations across the entire Gleason spectrum. So the Gleason scores of these 57 tumors are listed in this bottom bar here. So yellow is Gleason 6, this orange is 3+4, light brown is 4+3, red is 4+4, and dark brown is 4+5. So you can see in terms of the number of all the mutations, number of the non-silent mutations, silent mutations, as well as recurrent amplifications and deletions and ETS fusions. They are very evenly distributed across the Gleason spectrum, including Gleason 6 and higher grade tumors. Chromoplaxy is one of the characteristic features of cancer. In chromoplaxy, you see these chromosomes are broken up into pieces, and then these pieces are joined together. For example, in this case, the chromosome 1 are broken up. The fragments of the chromosome 1s are joined together with each other or joined with other fragments from chromosome 5, 7, and 9. Similarly, the fragments of the chromosome 3s are joined together with each other or joined with the fragments from the chromosome 8 and 12. And you can see the extent of the chromoplaxy is very similar in Gleason 6 cancers and other high-grade cancers. Therefore, molecular alterations are shared between Gleason 6 and high-grade prostate cancers that include ETS gene fusions, chromoplaxy, and hypermethylations of specific genes that I have not talked about. Although some of these changes are substantially less common in Gleason 6 tumors, they nevertheless are similar between Gleason 6 and high-grade cancers, and therefore support similar pathways of tumor development for Gleason 6 and high-grade prostate cancers. When we talk about prostate cancer diagnosis, it is very important to understand the context in which cancer diagnosis is made, because cancer has different implications in different types of prostate specimens. In pathology labs, we see 3 types of prostate specimens: radical prostatectomies, or RP, transurethral resection of the prostate, or TURP, or prostate needle biopsies. Dr. Eggener will tell you radical prostatectomy is one of the definitive treatments for prostate cancer. So when he takes out the whole prostate in its entirety, together with the seminal vesicles and the surrounding fat. He sends the specimen to the pathology lab. Then we will process and examine the entire specimen for the diagnosis, Gleason grade, and whether the cancer invades into the extraprostatic space and seminal vesicles. Transurethral resection of the prostate is usually performed for benign prostatic hyperplasia, although occasionally less than about 2% of the cases you see cancer. And prostate needle biopsy is a gold standard for diagnosing prostate cancer. Depending on the biopsy protocols, Dr. Eggener will take 10 to 15 slender cylinders of tissues or prostate cores, which accounts for really less than 0.1% of the entire gland. So the undersampling is a huge issue for prostate biopsy. So many studies have shown that Gleason 6 prostate cancer, when diagnosed in radical prostatectomy, I want to emphasize radical prostatectomy, it rarely has local invasion. The extraprostatic extension or invasion is reported in 0.28 to 3.9% of the cases. Seminal vesicle invasion is even rarer, reported in 0.17% of the cases. And there are no credible case reports of the regional lymph node metastases in Gleason 6 prostate cancer in radical prostatectomy. 15-year biochemical recurrence for organ-confined Gleason 6 cancer is less than 1.5%. And prostate cancer specific death is less than 1%. And it is hypothesized that reported cancer death in Gleason 6 cancer is probably due to high-grade cancer, undergraded as Gleason 6. Therefore, I agree that Gleason 6 prostate cancer in radical prostatectomy can be considered as non-cancer. And there have been many the debates and proposals that such lesions should be labeled as or called the indolent lesion of epithelial origin or idle lesion or inert lesion by Dr. Eggener. And Gleason 6 cancer in radical prostatectomy is often compared to NIFTP. NIFTP is a form of encapsulated follicular variant of papillomastoid carcinoma. It has a very low risk of adverse outcomes. Therefore, the cancer was removed from its name, and this tumor is renamed as non-invasive follicular thyroid neoplasm with papillary-like nuclear features, or NIFTP. But we need to understand the diagnosis of NIFTP can only be made after the tumor is entirely removed and carefully examined to look for capsular and vascular invasion and papillary architecture by pathologists. Therefore, NIFTP cannot be made on small biopsy specimens. Similarly, I will argue that Gleason 6 cancer can only be called idle or inert lesion only in radical prostatectomy, but not in prostate biopsy specimens. Gleason 6 cancer is also compared to PUNLUMP. PUNLUMP is an acronym for papillary urothelial neoplasm of low malignant potential, which is a type of non-invasive low-grade bladder cancer with excellent prognosis. It often recurs. The recurrence rate is reported to be 25 to 47%. However, metastasis is exceedingly rare. Therefore, the cancer was dropped from the nomenclature, and this tumor was renamed as lump to alleviate psychological or financial burdens associated with in cancer diagnosis. But a lump diagnosis really doesn't significantly change the management of the patient. The patient still needs repeat transurethral resection for visually incompletely resected or high volume tumor. This diagnosis but does assure a patient that he does not have a cancer diagnosis. So I agree, Gleason 6 prostate tumor should not be called cancer in radical prostatectomies. But the question that we are debating today is really, should it be labeled as cancer in prostate biopsy specimens? So it is very important to understand that Gleason 6 is not a single entity, rather it is a diverse group of the tumors. And there are 6 possibilities for Gleason 6 cancer diagnosed in prostate biopsies. And the studies have shown that all these scenarios are possible. The first possibility is the Gleason 6 cancer will stay dormant and will never become higher grade cancer during the life of the patient. Therefore, this type of the Gleason 6 tumor is considered as non-progressive. But some Gleason 6 cancers may become high grade or may progress during the follow-up. This is what I call progresses. Gleason 6 tumor may not progress. However, it may be the risk for harboring a high-grade tumor in the prostate gland that's missed by the biopsy, or it is a risk factor for developing high-grade cancer in the prostate gland. These are the lesions that I call harbingers. Finally, some high-grade tumors may be misgraded or misclassified by pathologists as Gleason 6 at the outset. These are the lesions which I call imposters. So for the non-progressors, I agree they are non-cancers. But for progressors, harbingers, or imposters, are they cancer or are they not cancers? So let's first look at the imposters. I am a pathologist, and I really don't want to throw pathologists under the bus, but Gleason grading reproducibility by pathologists have been a big issue since day one. And there have been many studies on that. Here, I'm showing you 2 studies that were conducted 20 years ago. In first study, 38 prostate cancers were graded by 41 general surgical pathologists. And this study found that the grading agreement amongst these 41 pathologists was only fair. The kappa value is 0.435. And if all these cases were agreed upon by 41 pathologists, the kappa value will be 1.0. More importantly, 43% of the Gleason 7 and 6% of the Gleason 8 tumors were misgraded as Gleason 6 tumors in this study. In another study of the grading by urological pathologists, remember these are the expert urological pathologists, the 10 pathologists graded 46 cases, and consensus was defined as long as 7 pathologists agreed on a grade. That's a consensus. So I would say that for urological pathologists, the bar was already set a little bit low. However, you can see 17% of these cases didn't have a consensus, and 7% of the cases were graded by pathologists as 6 or 7, 6, 7, or 8 to 10. So these the studies certainly showed that, again, the grading reproducibility is a big issue 20 years ago. And since then, pathologists have done tremendous amount of work to improve grading reproducibility. But our work is certainly not perfect yet. A recent study of Gleason grading reproducibility among general pathologists in India certainly made a point. You can see that 64% of the Gleason 6 cancer were graded as 7 or above. In contrast, 22% of the Gleason 7 cancer were misgraded as Gleason 6 or below, and 2% of the Gleason 8 cancer was misclassified as 6 or below. So again, these studies show that the Gleason grading reproducibility continues to be a diagnostic challenge. So my advice for you as a patient is you may want to request a second opinion if you have any concerns over the Gleason grade for your prostate cancer. Another important issue with a Gleason grading is upgrading of biopsy Gleason 6. Studies have shown that 25 to 40% of the Gleason 6 on prostate biopsies are actually Gleason 7 or higher in repeat biopsies or radical prostatectomy specimens due to sampling issues. As I mentioned earlier, prostate biopsies sample only less than 0.1% of the gland, and that leaves a huge margin of error for undersampling and undergrading. Recent studies have shown that the MRI imaging in the targeted biopsies may improve detection of, but still misses a clinically significant cancer. This table shows you MRI diagnostic accuracy for clinically significant prostate cancer. If Pirate's score is set at 3 and above, then you can detect 89% of the clinically significant cancer and still miss about 11% of the clinically significant cancer. If you set the Pirate's score at 4 and above, and you're going to detect about 72% of the clinically significant cancer and miss about 28% of the clinically significant prostate cancer. So with these caveats, you want to ask yourself, if Gleason score 6 is not called cancer, then a significant number of the men with the Gleason 6 cancer will not be followed as closely and potentially may progress to incurable cancer and may miss the treatment opportunities. A very important question to ask when Gleason 6 cancer is diagnosed in biopsy is, will Gleason 6 prostate cancer progress to higher grade cancer? Because if it doesn't progress to high grade cancer, then you have nothing to worry about. But if it does progress, then you really need to worry about it. A grade progression means higher Gleason grades in repeat prostate biopsies. And the studies have shown that the grade progression is reported in about 20%, 30%, and 40% at 5, 10, and 15 years in several large active surveillance cohorts. And 50 to 80% of these grade progression occurs within 2.5 years indicative of undersampling by the initial biopsies. That's the lesions, and I call harbinger lesions. However, in about 20 to 50% of the cases, grade progression occurs after 2 and 2.5 years, and 2/3 of these cases actually occur in the same areas of the prior positive sites. Therefore, they may be indicative of true tumor progressions. And there is a molecular evidence to support that. Salami et al. Conducted a repeated molecular assessment of 15 Gleason 6 tumors using MRI tracking to ensure the same tumor focus was sampled and studied. And he found there was shared clonality between the initial Gleason 6 and subsequent high-grade tumors of the same location, supporting the possibility of progression of the Gleason 6 cancer to higher grade cancer. You may say, I really don't care whether the Gleason 6 cancer will progress to the high grade, as long as it doesn't kill patients, right? But I'm sorry to say that the Gleason 6 the cancer does kill patients. The European randomized study of the screening for prostate cancer, or ERSPC, rather than a part, is a PSA-based prostate cancer screening for core patients of 54 to 74 patients. This study demonstrates that during a follow-up of almost 13 years, the cancer mortality is reported in 151 patients, or 4.3% of the patients. And of these 151 patients, 22, almost 15%, were reported in Gleason 6 cancers. And about 15 patients, or 10% of these prostate cancer deaths, were reported in low-risk clinical stage T1 and T2 Gleason 6 prostate cancer. And prostate cancer specific death has also been reported in active surveillance cohorts, although the rate is very low. The 10 to 15 year cancer specific death is about 0.1%, but it is not zero. Therefore, while very low or low risk cancer is Gleason 6 cancer by definition, but the reverse cannot be assumed. That is, Gleason 6 cancer cannot be assumed to be low risk when diagnosed in prostate biopsies. It actually has a pretty wide range of the risk categories. Obviously, most of the cases are very low risk or low risk, but some cases are the intermediate or even high risk categories. So racial disparity in prostate cancer is also well known in terms of the cancer biology and outcomes. We know that African Americans in general have a higher grade and worse outcomes than Caucasians. And the studies have shown that African Americans with very low or low risk prostate cancer are more likely to have adverse pathology at the radical prostatectomies. In a prostate cancer death with Gleason score 6 disease is significantly high in African Americans, 0.4%, versus the non-Black patients, 0.22% in a Sears study. In the genomic risk scores, which are the risk scores calculated based on the genomic alterations. So the genomic risk scores in prostate, in Gleason 6 tumors is significantly higher among African Americans than among white men. However, for Gleason 7 and above prostate cancer, the genomic risk score is not significantly different between African Americans and white men. And these studies the proof that disparities in Gleason 6 tumors may in part be driven by the underlying tumor biology, although the studies have shown that the disparities in high-grade tumors may largely be accounted for by social factors and healthcare access. So the data regarding the racial differences are still emerging. However, I will argue any conclusions, including labeling Gleason 6 as non-cancer, should be vigorously tested in African Americans and other racial groups. So I hope that I have convinced you that the Gleason 6 prostate cancer in radical prostatectomy specimens can be considered non-cancer. However, Gleason 6 cancer in prostate biopsies have a diverse range of clinical behaviors. Although vast majority of them have indolent behavior and excellent prognosis, some may progress and cause significant morbidity and even death. Therefore, my opinion is Gleason score 6 cancer diagnosed in prostate biopsy should still be called cancer. Rather than debating whether Gleason 6 is cancer or not, we need to change what patients think when they hear they have Gleason 6 cancer, and the urologists need to reassure and educate their patients. And there's also need to further define or further refine the risk stratification to identify those patients with Gleason 6 or any Gleason grade for that matter, who may have aggressive disease and therefore need immediate treatment, or those patients who may have indolent disease and therefore can be safely followed.
Well, Dr. Zhou, thank you very much. And we have to move along. And Dr. Eggener, the floor is yours.
Well, first, a very thorough and commendable job to Dr. Zhou for laying out his argument. The good news is there are many things we agree on, but it wouldn't be a healthy educational debate unless there were many things we disagreed on. And I'm going to lay out to you in what I think is a very logical and sensible argument why the world would be a better place if Gleason 6 lost the cancer label. And I would just preface it by saying that I spend most of my waking hours taking care of guys with prostate cancer or at risk of prostate cancer or doing research on prostate cancer. I've seen thousands of men with prostate cancer. I'm a huge fan of treating prostate cancer when it's appropriate. I also have a huge cohort of men who do surveillance. I'm a huge fan of it. But I also wish that for many of those men, I could undiagnose their Gleason 6 prostate cancer, because it's not harmless finding out about your Gleason 6. But the take-home summary is, why are we diagnosing a cancer that is literally incapable of causing symptoms, spreading to other parts of your body, or shortening your life? And I want to lay out to you on a macro level my argument for that. So first of all, I do work with some companies to work on newer ways of treating prostate cancer. None of these are mentioned here. And the only relevant disclosure would be taking the cancer label away from Gleason 6 might harm urologists and their practice, but I absolutely think for public health reasons and individual men's reasons, it should not be called cancer. It's the right thing to do. So number one, how did we get here? Number two, absolutely outcomes of surveillance are superb, but I'd like to lay out my utopian future of Gleason 6. To me, it's the single most important career objective I have on a research level for the remainder of my career, to at least force the conversation. It's a healthy conversation, and I think it really needs to be had on an international scale, and it's happening. I can fill you in on all the efforts we're doing, but that conversation is happening, and we'll see how it plays out. And then I want to lay out the counter arguments, some of which Dr. Zhou elegantly mentioned, and just give my response. So how did we get here? These are death rates from prostate cancer in the US starting in the 1930s. And as many of you in this audience know, for about 60 years, the way guys found out they had prostate cancer is it had spread elsewhere in the body, or it was big and bulky and it could be felt on the exam. Right around here, late 80s, early 90s, PSA comes out. And the idea, which made a ton of sense, is let's find all these cancers early. Let's treat everyone aggressively. We'll save all these lives. Kumbaya. What could possibly go wrong? Early detection, aggressive treatment. And the really good news is death rates have dropped 50% in the United States from prostate cancer. Hallelujah if you're one of those men. But the dark, dirty secret of what's been going on is that the pandemic of unnecessary overdiagnosis and overtreatment. And that's Gleason 6 cancer. So there's literally been millions of men in the United States, tens of millions around the world, who have been unnecessarily diagnosed and treated for Gleason 6. And if the prostate was on our elbow and scraping it off had no side effects, great, diagnose and treat everybody. But everyone in this audience knows that even with an expert treating you, there is a risk of side effects. And so the elephant in the room is this overdetection and overtreatment. What's the source of it? This is a classic study of where they took men in Detroit who died of other causes, never knew they had prostate cancer. And if you look at their age, basically if you're a man, you take your age, you put a percentage after it, that's the likelihood of you having microscopic prostate cancer in your prostate. 50-year-old men, half of them have prostate cancer. 3% of them are going to die of it. We do PSA screening and find all these cancers. We're finding a whole load of cancer that no one needs to know about. We want to find the lethal ones, potentially lethal ones, treat them, keep our hands off the other ones. Now, in one slide, I want to show you what we know about Gleason 6, otherwise known as grade group 1. We did a study with our colleagues at Northwestern, 2,500 men who had prostatectomies where the final pathology specimen showed only Gleason 6. What was the likelihood it got beyond the lining of the prostate? About a 1 in 500 chance, 0.28%. So Dr. Zhou argues it can grow into the outside the capsule, but he didn't tell you that, at least in our study, it was 0.28%. What are the chances of it going to the seminal vesicles of those 2,500 men? And these are expert pathologists. 0. Seminal vesicles sit right next to the prostate. More meaningful aggressive prostate cancers do grow into the seminal vesicle. In 14,000 men having surgery, what was the chance of finding a Gleason 6 that had metastasized to a lymph node? 0. You're getting the theme here. If you operate on someone for prostate cancer, these were 24,000 men, of which 12,000 men had surgery where the final cancer was Gleason 6. They've probably been living with it for years or even decades. You follow them for 15 years after surgery, and it's basically a never event that the cancer had spread elsewhere in the decades it had been there prior to surgery. This is as indolent and wimpy as it comes. And I still assert, and have never heard evidence otherwise, there has literally never been a man in the history of time who's had a metastasis or died from pure Gleason 6. They die from higher grade cancers. This is somewhat busy if you're not used to these types of figures, but this is nearly 2,000 men having surgery at a place in Germany. They have Gleason 7 cancer. But basically, if you look at this top line here, the cure rate stays at nearly 100% if you have just a little tiny bit of that pattern 4. So if you have only Gleason 6, your cure rate is basically 100% following surgery. Totally unnecessary surgery. Dr. Zhou says we can call it a non-cancer after your prostate's out. Well, that'll be great. I'll take out a lot of prostates, and then I'll tell guys, we just took out your prostate, you're at risk of side effects, you just had a surgery, and oh, by the way, it's not cancer. Men are gonna love that. This is the study I was referring to earlier, When I was at Sloan Kettering, we combined our data with Johns Hopkins and the University of Michigan and other places. And I would just tell you that 12,000 men had surgery where the final pathology showed Gleason 6. And at the top here, where you can't even see the darkly shaded areas, that would be the likelihood of dying of prostate cancer over the next 20 years. It's a never event. This is if you have brachytherapy, a form of radiation. Gleason 6, you follow them for 14 years, the likelihood of dying of the prostate cancer, less than 1%. Why did those guys die of prostate cancer? Those really, really, really rare situations? Probably because they had unsampled, unknown Gleason 7 or higher that ultimately caused problems. So in summary, for the first part, if your cure rate following a treatment for a quote unquote cancer approaches 100%, you can either say hallelujah and pat yourself on the back as the physician, or you say there's 100% need, we need to rethink the terminology of what we call this, how we diagnose it, and how we manage it. And we're making tremendous strides. When I was in training in the early 2000s, I literally never saw a guy on surveillance. The most common thing we did was operate on people for Gleason 6. I look back on it with horror of all the guys we harmed in that fashion. Surveillance is great, okay? But surveillance isn't harmless either. Many of you guys know there's anxiety related to it. You're waiting for your PSA. You need a biopsy periodically, which has a risk of infection, albeit low, but if you've experienced that, they can be really scary. You still are thinking about your cancer. You may not be able to get life insurance. Your friends wonder why the heck you're not treating your cancer. They think you're Looney Tunes for doing observation. But guys on surveillance with Gleason 6 do phenomenally well. 76,000 men in Sweden, they were doing this as early as the early 90s. And basically, if you're low risk or Gleason 6, you follow men for 15 years. These two lines here, one line is men with Gleason 6. The other line are men in the population without prostate cancer. So what it showed is if you have Gleason 6 prostate cancer compared to every other guy without known prostate cancer, your survival is the same. Why would we ever want to know about something that doesn't impact our longevity and can't cause symptoms? 1,800 men at Johns Hopkins on active surveillance, really strict criteria. Don't pay attention to the graph here, it'll confuse you. Some men need treatment in a delayed fashion, but most men go 15 years without ever needing treatment. And whether you never need treatment or you get delayed treatment, at 15 years, the likelihood of that cancer metastasizing or dying or causing a death, 0.1%, 2 men out of 1,800. So it's not a 100% success rate with surveillance, but 99.9 if you follow that criteria. At the University of Toronto, Laurie Klotz, who I think has spoken to this group, much, much looser criteria. He's letting people in that had palpable disease, bulkier disease, some Gleason 7s, very loosely following them. And guess what? 2% of the men, even with that really loose criteria, eventually had a metastasis. And how did they metastasize? It wasn't their Gleason 6 that was seen on biopsy. It was unknown areas of Gleason 7 or higher. And really interestingly, if you look at the men who died of their prostate cancer with Gleason 6, these are all men from a bygone era. They had 6 samples taken from their prostate. There were no MRIs. You take a sample again 3 years later. You all know and have lived through. We take a minimum of 12 samples. There's an MRI to make things smarter. You undergo a restaging biopsy within a year. So these are very different men. And these are the few men that died from their prostate cancer. I and many others think the world would be a better place if it wasn't called cancer. This is not a new idea. This is a really influential group from Johns Hopkins that published this paper about 8-9 years ago. This is an influential group from London. This is our group that recently wrote about it. And let's just take a step back and talk to sort of the common man, the man on the street, not someone as knowledgeable as you as prostate cancer. You go to the dictionary. The definition of benign is something that does not threaten health or life. Something that's malignant is something with potentially unlimited growth that expands locally by invasion and can metastasize. It's an absolute no-brainer where Gleason 6 fits in. It's benign. We should undiagnose these men, not call it cancer, or it should just be left alone. Dr. Zhou listed the things that have been proposed as new names for Gleason 6. To be honest with you, I don't really give a hoot what the renaming is. I would leave that up to the pathologist with input from others. It just does not warrant a cancer label. If it's not called cancer, it has to be a non-cancer. Call it a precancer. I kind of think of it as, you know what? It's the equivalent of a colon polyp. You know, you go get your colonoscopy, and if they find polyps, they might say, you know what, let's see in a year, 2 years, 5 years. But no one's going and ripping out your colon for it, and they're certainly not calling it cancer. But it's only when they find a real cancer that it warrants real treatment. It should be extremely rare to treat Gleason 6. Now, across the country, about 50% of men with Gleason 6 are still undergoing treatment. I can tell you from all my colleagues, friends, prostate cancer experts, most of us across the country, 90–95% of men with Gleason 6 go on surveillance. I can't tell you, I can probably count on one hand the last decade or so how many men with Gleason 6 that I've recommended treatment, maybe 2 hands over the last decade. And if we no longer call it Gleason 6, they're not going to go away and just kind of, you know, call us if you ever get a metastasis. You're still monitoring these guys. They have an elevated PSA. And you know what? Maybe Gleason 6 is a marker for finding Gleason 7. But our goal in screening should be to find Gleason 7 and then act accordingly, and to not find Gleason 6, because you don't need to know about it. But you still follow with PSA, rectal exam, maybe MRI, exactly what we do for every other man being screened. So I just mentioned to you the goals of screening. Nearly everyone who's thoughtful as a clinician in this space now, our goal is to try to find Gleason 7 and not diagnose Gleason 6. That's what all these biomarkers are for. 5, 4K, Select MDX, ExoDX, ISO-PSA. That's what MRIs are for, not diagnosing Gleason 6, finding Gleason 7. And guess what? This isn't new. History repeats itself. We've been here before. Gleason scoring became the de facto, widely adopted scoring system in the late 80s. And it's been modified twice. You might be surprised to hear the reason the system is so goofy is there used to be Gleason 2 through 5. And guess what? It didn't meet criteria for cancer under the microscope or clinically. So they got rid of it. In 2014, the rules changed again. This big pie of Gleason 6 got much more restrictive. So some of the old Gleason 6 now got upshifted to Gleason 7, and that just led to treatment. And we've done this in prostate cancer. Dr. Zhou showed you we've done this in bladder cancer, things that used to be called cancer. When thoughtful, thorough folks come through and they say, patients don't need to, you know, we don't need to treat it as cancer, we're torturing people, and the world is a better place for it. It's been done in thyroid cancer. There's conversations ongoing in breast cancer, in melanoma, and other cancers. But let's talk about the most counter arguments. They're really important to have, and that's why these types of debates and discussions are incredibly important. The most common thing I hear, particularly from pathologists, and they're absolutely right, is microscopically it meets the definition of a cancer. It doesn't have a basal cell layer. Heck yeah, absolutely right. But all you as a guy care about, and all I care about is this thing ever gonna clinically act as a cancer? A cancer is something that can alter your quality of life or quantity of life. And by absolutely every criteria, Gleason 6 cannot do that. Another common thing I hear is, oh, the biopsy showed Gleason 6, but about 20–25% of men have Gleason 7 in there that you just don't know about. And if we remove every prostate with Gleason 6 on biopsy, we're gonna find all those Gleason 7s. Well, to me, that's a really weak argument. find the Gleason 7. We have tools available. We can sample every part of the prostate on biopsy. We have MRIs. If you find Gleason 7, consider treatment. But if it's not there, why would you want to treat it? And interestingly, that argument of you do a prostatectomy and 25% of them have higher Gleason score, guess what? In the modern era, if you have Gleason 6 on biopsy, if I do an MRI on you, then I do a smarter biopsy the second time around within a year, about 20% of them have Gleason 7. It's always been there. You just sampled it and found it with your smarter way of finding it. As Dr. Zhou mentioned, genomically, molecularly, cytologically, all these fancy scientific ways of determining some similarities between Gleason 6 and Gleason 7. Is it true? Absolutely. But all you care about, all your loved ones care about, all I care about as a clinician, I don't care about molecularly, genomically, cytologically. All I care about in real men is this going to impact your life in any meaningful way? And right now, all Gleason 6 diagnosis does is makes you do surveillance or treatment. It saddles you with the diagnosis of a cancer, it changes your self-identity, and it literally is not capable of changing anything with your quality of life or your longevity. Another thing I commonly hear, well, it's just better to know. It's just a test, you know, it's there. I hope many or all of you would agree that knowing isn't necessarily better. So again, half of guys in their 50s are walking around with Gleason 6. Should we be telling those guys? So few of them need to know. And knowing obligates you to surveillance. But I would argue that doing screening, ongoing screening, for a disease that often and usually takes years or decades to show itself, you're going to find your Gleason 7s or higher in a timely fashion by just doing screening and not labeling guys with Gleason 6 as having cancer. So in conclusion, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, I wish we could go kind of line by line, slide by slide, and Dr. Zhou could eat apart my slides and vice versa. But I feel really strongly that Gleason 6 should be benign or a precancer or some other term, but it should not be a cancer. And I'm a really firm believer that for individual men and for public health as a whole throughout our country and throughout the world would dramatically improve by downshifting and removing the cancer label from Gleason 6. So thanks for your time and attention, and hopefully at least stimulated your brain to think about this as an option.
Well, Dr. Eggener, thank you. I think it's time for our final poll. Joe, if you want to put that on and read that. Oops. Well, let's see. Still voting. If we can compare it.
What you have for a comparison is the before was 55 yes, that's now 22 no, yes. It was 10 no, that's now up to 47 no, and we still have 29% or 29% now, 31% unsure.
And let's see. Well, and more voted the last time, so maybe we have some more uncertain people. Okay, I guess it's time to start asking.
Howard, this is Rick, and you know, by the, I think we do have to say, by the rules of the Oxford debate, Dr. Eggener has gotten a much bigger shift in percentages.
Yes.
So I'll let you declare the winner, but I do think we need to recognize that, don't you? It's
a dramatic change. It's a shift in perception, and it seems that Dr. Eggener won, although he and Ming were both very gentlemanly in saying that what they were interested in was education and discussion, not debate. So if you're a gentleman, that's fine, but I guess we declare Dr. Eggener the winner. And I should disclose that Dr. Eggener was my first doctor. He put me on active surveillance. And so I went through a lot of things with him involving some of these issues. Maybe we can start asking some questions. Rick Davis actually brings up a good point for Dr. Eggener. And don't worry, Ming, we're not going to ignore you. You're not disgraced. At any rate, Rick mentions that I think it was 90% of men, in high-level institutions who were diagnosed with Gleason 6 go on active surveillance. And he wonders, what is the situation in the community?
Yeah, it's very different. So there's a ton of variety and a lot of studies that show your likelihood of going on active surveillance depends on the part of the country you live in and the clinician that you see. And that's the essence of it. I would just back up a little bit and I would just say, Dr. Zhou and I are little bits in a huge prostate cancer community, and there's no, and I mean this wholeheartedly, there's no winners or losers in this debate. We are, we all have the genuine interest of our patients and scientific rigor. And, we all go to conferences and there's healthy debates back and forth. And we've got a lot more in common. And we would both agree that this is, and hopefully I'm not speaking for him, but this is a really important conversation for pathologists, urologists, radiation oncologists, and men diagnosed with prostate cancer. As Howard knows, I've roped into some of these efforts that I think are important to at least force the conversation. And we'll see how it all plays out. I don't have a horse in this race. I certainly have a vote and a bias, but I think it's a conversation worth having.
Okay. Jim, do you want to start taking from the pool of questions?
Can I just make a quick comment?
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Zhou.
I just want to congratulate Dr. Eggener for his excellent presentations. So I agree that we actually agree on a lot of issues, right? And we both agree that we really need to have a multivariate sort of prediction models that will identify which patient with Gleason 6 cancer is more likely to harbor high-grade cancer in the prostate gland, therefore should be treated, and which patient is not likely to harbor high-grade cancer, therefore can be followed safely.
So, all right, well, I can actually come in with a question. I can introduce a third party here. A urologist, Dr. William Catalona, who's been a leading figure in urology for the past 30 years. I've interviewed him. He disputes claims that there are no documented cases of Gleason 3+3 being life-threatening. He says, quote, all men with Gleason 3+3 are at substantial risk of their disease being underestimated. So I'd be interested in both doctors responding to Dr. Catalona.
I'll keep it brief. I'm still waiting for him to show me the man that's died from Gleason 6. I'll change my mind when he shows me that first case. And second of all, he's right that they're at significant risk of being underestimated, but that's just because their entire prostate hasn't been thoroughly evaluated or sampled. He's right. If someone has a mildly elevated PSA, the first biopsy shows Gleason 6. As every guy on this call or webinar knows, if they're on surveillance, it doesn't just stop there and you cross your fingers and hope for the best. You say, let's make certain there's nothing that was missed on the first biopsy that we need to know about, hence typically the MRI and a more accurate biopsy. And you get more information. And some of those guys really early on find out that they actually have Gleason 7 or higher, and they might get treatment appropriately. But about 80% of those guys get an even higher level of comfort that all they really have is this wimpy, Gleason 6, and they can comfortably and confidently go on surveillance.
Dr. Zhou, what do you say to Dr. Catalona?
And I would say that, I have not seen a patient with a Gleason 6 cancer who died of the cancer. However, I did read the literature, even in the European, the randomized trials, right? You do have the patients who had a biopsy diagnosis of Gleason 6 cancer, then later on developed the metastases, died of the Gleason 6 cancer, or died of the Gleason 6 cancer that was diagnosed in the prostate biopsy. My point is really that the Gleason 6 cancer in the biopsy is really not a single entity, right? It has a range of the behavior. Most of them are not aggressive, are indolent, but some of those patients actually had aggressive disease because of the progression, because of the imposter lesions, which I described, right? So by labeling Gleason 6 cancer as non-cancer, you are gonna miss those progressors, you're gonna miss those imposter lesions.
Everything Dr. Zhou said is accurate, but one important clarification from those European studies is he's referring to men that on biopsy had Gleason 6,
Yep.
then had treatment with radiation or surgery. Every single one of those guys that died of prostate cancer years down the road, and there were about 10% of them that he mentioned, they actually at the time of diagnosis had Gleason 7 or higher. It was never known because in the 90s, they just randomly threw darts into the prostate. And nowadays we have such a better way of finding that. But literally, if you only have Gleason 6, I'll still stand by the comment, it's impossible to die of your disease. If 10% of guys with Gleason 6 were dying of prostate cancer, we wouldn't do surveillance. None of you guys would be on surveillance. But it's basically a never event. I probably got close to 1,000 guys on surveillance. I've been doing it for about 14 years. To my knowledge, I don't have a single guy who's gotten burned by that approach in the ultimate way where he's going to die of his prostate cancer. It will eventually happen, but it's such a random, rare event.
Yeah, I understand that. But Scott, now how would you treat a patient with a Gleason? We're talking about the Gleason 6 cancer in the biopsy, but sort of intermediate or high risk categories. So for example, the PSA is 15, right? The biopsy, say, 10 out of 12 course, they have a Gleason 6 cancer. We'll still label that patient as non-cancer. Therefore, you can let that patient go.
Great question. And some of those patients, so they're incredibly rare. I mean, you see a lot of biopsies. It's pretty rare to see 10 samples that show Gleason 6. Some of those patients are on my two hands, the examples of patients I have treated over the last decade or so. But other guys, if their PSA is high, you say, but they only have Gleason 6, you say, what's causing their PSA to be high? Is it because they have a massive prostate, or is there really Gleason 7 or higher elsewhere, and let's go find it with a biopsy? It's not just empirically, oh, let's categorically treat them. But you're absolutely right. Those patients do exist.
But Scott, if you label these as a non-cancer, then the patient will not have a second chance for additional workup and additional biopsies, right?
So I would disagree on that. let's say your patient with a PSA of 15 and Gleason 6 on biopsy. What do I do now? I say, let's get an MRI and a biopsy to see if there's a higher Gleason score that we missed the first time around. If Gleason 6 wasn't called cancer, they have a PSA of 15 with a negative biopsy. What do I do now with a guy with a PSA of 15 and a negative biopsy? I say, we got to figure out why your PSA is 15. Let's get an MRI and a biopsy. The same exact thing I would have done if it was called cancer.
Yeah, that is true. But you know, again, you are telling the patient, okay, you have a non-cancer lesion, right? So, you know, for some patients, you know, it will be a relief. Well, okay, you know, I don't have cancer. But I agree with you because of the other risk factors that you as a urologist should follow up those patients.
Okay, Jim, why don't you throw out some of the questions?
We've got a lot of questions from the audience tonight, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. We're not going to be able to answer all of these questions. And at the outset, I have to remind folks that we can't give individual medical advice about individual situations and that sort of thing. It's really more focused on the specific topic and the debate and our discussion. So I'll start out with one that reads, I heard Dr. Eggener say, does Gleason 6 act clinically as a cancer? No. Is that correct?
I'll let Dr. Zhou take that one because I already stated my opinion.
So no, is that correct? Your position is no.
Yeah, it's something that, you know, again, and I tried hammering home the point. Clinically, I mean, everyone in the world, my 14-year-old daughter, if I ask her, what is a cancer? It's something that can potentially kill you or potentially alter your life through symptoms or problems. And that's a clinical definition, you know, clinical problems, death or quality of life issues. And absolutely positively, Gleason 6 can't cause either of those.
Let me answer that question. So my position is Gleason 6 cancer is cancer, but let's find a better way to risk stratify it so that we can give patients some ideas, okay, in terms of what is the possibility of having a bad cancer in his prostate gland, what is the possibility of a metastases 5 years, 10 years down the road, and what is the possibility of dying of prostate cancer in 10 years or 15 years, right? So we need to have a better way to give patients the estimate, the risk estimate.
But Ming, your point is a good one. But for Gleason 6, the answer to all of your questions, the risk of everything is 0%, 0%, 0%, and 0%. So for an olive branch,
not for the Gleason 6 cancer diagnosed in the prostate, the biopsy though.
Yeah.
But
can we agree on the following, that if Gleason 6 is still called a cancer, that it should be extremely rare, almost a never event to treat it, and it might be a risk factor for harboring Gleason 7 or higher, and maybe you should have an eyebrow up looking for Gleason 7, but that you almost shouldn't be allowed to treat a patient with radiation or surgery unless you find Gleason 7 or higher. That would be my argument.
Well, as a pathologist, I certainly cannot, comment on the treatment. However, I agree with you, right? For Gleason, if the patient has a Gleason 6 cancer in the biopsy, right, we again need to look at the other risk factors, right? And using the other modalities, the diagnostic modalities, so that we can provide an accurate risk assessment for these patients. Hopefully, for most of those patients, right? So they don't need treatment, or they don't need active surveillance, right?
Right.
Okay, and but the point is we still, so the point is really, so it makes no sense to argue whether it is cancer or not cancer. It is, the argument is we really need to have a better risk stratification tools for those patients.
You know, if I could interject something too, you know, it does make a difference whether you call it cancer. You know, as someone who, you know, had a reduced ability to buy life insurance once I was tagged with the cancer diagnosis. And I've met so many men who, once they've been told they have cancer, you know, or as Scott had said earlier, are tortured and, you know, have anxiety issues, which ultimately may lead them to having surgery that they didn't actually need just to get what they think will be peace of mind. So, you know, what you call a rose is not a rose is not a rose. You know, it would be, you know, from my point of view, and I'm biased too, you know, it would be great to get rid of that cancer diagnosis. I mean, once you're stuck with that, you can't make it go away.
And I agree with you.
If I can sneak in another question, well, and Ming, you can answer. But have another question. If you have a Gleason 6 and a PSA of 10, how do you find a Gleason 7 without a biopsy?
Impossible.
Gleason 7, the Gleason grading is based on morphology. That means that you have to have a biopsy.
Right.
Okay, Jim?
Here's a question from the audience, and this question has actually come up in support groups earlier this week. The question is, should we make a distinction between low volume Gleason 6 versus high volume Gleason 6? And whether it's bilateral or one-sided.
That's a great point, and it comes up every day in my clinic, including today when I'm teaching the residents or fellows. So there are some tried and true predictors. So if my understanding is almost all of these men on the webinar are on active surveillance. If you have Gleason 6 and you're on active surveillance, there are predictors of the likelihood of you ever being diagnosed with Gleason 7 or higher the rest of your life. One of those predictors, and it absolutely influences how often I see you, follow you, do a biopsy on you, is how many millimeters of Gleason 6 you have. Someone who's had a thorough sampling and has 1 millimeter Gleason 6 is very different than the patient Dr. Zhou mentioned that has 6, 8, 10 cores with Gleason 6, and their risk profile is different. There is zero data that I'm aware of that it makes any difference whether you're, let's say you have 3 biopsies that show Gleason 6 with 5 millimeters total of cancer, whether it's all on one side or whether it's on both sides of the prostate. So that doesn't play into it any clinically for me. Dr. Zhou, any?
I agree. So, you know, this just comes down to, again, the question to have a better sort of risk prediction models.
Can I ask a follow-up on that too? Because we've been running into a lot of individuals who have high volume Gleason 6. And, you know, from a risk point of view, you know, how is their risk different from, let's say, somebody with a favorable intermediate Gleason 3+4? And which one of those two is at greater risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the risk profile can be pretty similar. You know, low volume, intermediate risk, and high volume, low risk. But even the higher volume Gleason 6, what that's really predicting is a higher likelihood of either having unsampled, undiagnosed Gleason 7 or converting into Gleason 7 at some point in the future. And that's what you're really keeping an eye out for. And that's why you follow those guys a little bit more rigorously. But again, and I didn't even get into it in this discussion, but many of you already know, there are many men with low volume Gleason 7 who should be on surveillance and do phenomenally well.
Right.
So that's, you know, first things first, but
Amen.
So, we should do a time check here. I mean, most of us are willing to stay a little bit later. I don't want to impose on the doctors. Are you willing to go a little bit longer?
Sure.
absolutely.
Okay. So Jim,
Dr. Zhou and I, and particularly me, I've been talking too much. Let's hear more from the questions from the audience. That's probably the most useful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The next one I have, and Dr. Eggener, you may have answered this. You did sort of for me with your colon cancer analogy. The question is, how do you keep men engaged in their prostate health if they're told they have a precancer?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is one of the concerns I hear about. You know, guys are just going to stop thinking about it and disappear. The way I look at it, it's like any health, follow-up or decision. You get advice, and then ultimately, as the man, you decide whether you're going to do it or not. It's no different than the doctor telling you have high blood pressure and you got to do something about it. You're going to decide whether you're going to, do diet, lifestyle, show up to the doctor again, get it checked again. I mean, it's ultimately their responsibility. So they all have an elevated PSA. So there is a marker and a reason for following up. So I would hope that it wouldn't be an issue.
maybe I can throw something related to this in. Are urologists and pathologists concerned about lawsuits? If Gleason 6 is declared non-cancerous, the man, doesn't necessarily have anything to follow through on, and then suddenly discovers he has a more aggressive, even life-threatening cancer. So, how important are, our lawsuits concerns?
Scott, you want to go first?
Yeah, that's the reason we have consensus statements and guidelines and guardrails of what's considered standard practice. And it really takes a major deviation to be legally susceptible. And I put a lot of guys with Gleason 7 on surveillance, and it's a very thorough discussion. And then I documented in a note, and those guys have a risk of bad things happening down the road. It's relatively low, but I tell them overtly, you have an X% chance of regretting this decision and getting burned by it. And many guys still choose to do it. And I put it in the note and it's documented and I'm legally covered. I don't believe in jinxes, but I've never been sued for anything related to prostate cancer surveillance.
I think pathologists are concerned about the potential legal the issues associated with calling Gleason 6 non-cancer, because they're concerned that if the patient, if a high-grade cancer pops up in the patient, right, they may go back to look at the original biopsy specimens, and you're going to find some pathologists who will differ from you in your grading, right? Some pathologists may say, well, I think there is a minor component of for in this you missed this sort of potentially higher grade component, therefore that's why the patient has this progression. So I'm concerned that will cause a upgrade by pathologists because of that concern.
And Jim?
All right. We've got kind of a long question here. If we are concerned that men will take a cavalier approach to their prostate cancer if we call it non-cancer, shouldn't we be equally concerned about men who will insist on treatment for low volume, low grade, non-aggressive cancer because of fear of the word cancer? Shouldn't urologists and oncologists be handing handing newly diagnosed men books to read. And how do you educate the patient about this? And this is the gist of the question.
That's a whole separate, 20-minute lecture. But there's a lot to say about that. Yeah. There's a lot to say. I hear from some urologists, oh, guys are freaked out about their Gleason 6. They want treatment. I'm a surgeon, I do surgery, hammer nail philosophy. I mean, what everyone needs is a, thoughtful discussion laying out the rationale for surveillance. I'm not so concerned, I may be naive, but I'm not so concerned about guys being cavalier if it's not called a cancer. I mean, we don't have some massive worry in the urologic community that guys with an elevated PSA are being cavalier and they're never going to check it again. That's not an issue. And in essence, all these guys with Gleason 6, if it wasn't called cancer, they get converted to, guys with an elevated PSA. And most guys, nearly all guys with an elevated PSA know they need some medical follow-up and attention. And I don't see them disappearing, but maybe I'm naive.
Yeah, if I could do it, right, I would call the Gleason cancer, the prostate cancer, Gleason 6, 7, 8, and 9 as a prostate tumor, then assign a risk. And then the outcome, prognosis, and the treatment will be based on the risk assessment. So certainly, that's there is a precedent for that. The GI stromal tumor, gastrointestinal stromal tumor, is called stromal tumor. It's not called cancer. Obviously, the GI stromal tumor also has a wide, the biological, the range, right? Some are clearly benign, others are clearly malignant. Yet even malignant tumors are still called tumor, not cancer or not sarcoma. But we do a comprehensive risk assessment for those tumors as well, so that the patients can be treated and followed accordingly.
Yeah, Dr.
Right.
Zhou, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Howard.
Yeah, Dr. Zhou, I mean, you can hear, I think, on the patient side of things here about anxiety issues and problems with health insurance and life insurance because of that label. And during the course of your discussion or debate or whatever you want to call it, I think you both mentioned this bladder cancer that was reclassified, and I had the sense that it was reclassified as non-cancerous in part for social and economic and financial reasons. Do those economic, social, and financial reasons affect what the pathologist, the way the pathologist thinks about this? Are those adequate grounds to make change?
Yeah, I certainly think that the pathologist should they think about those things as well. So we in general do not have a patient contact. So therefore we focus on diagnosing cancer or diagnosing this disease that we see on the slides. We tend not to think too much about these social legal issues. I agree with you that we pathologists should think more about those issues. And as a matter of fact, that the reason that a portion of the low-grade bladder cancer is renamed as a Pathology is exactly for that reason. I mentioned although that renaming doesn't change the patient management that much, but it doesn't it does relieve the patient of these psychological burdens and perhaps in a financial the burdens as well. So, but I think this also brings up a topic that we really need to re-educate. So to educate and re-educate not only our patients, but also the society in general about the implications of the cancer diagnosis.
I think the public just hears that word and they freak out. And and as Scott said earlier, the idea of leaving a cancer in place and just learning, or what we call a cancer, and learning to live with it is exactly the opposite of probably what the American Cancer Society and other organizations historically did. And so, you do get pushback from people, and it's kind of the curiosity to some people that you would do that. So there's a lot of social factors in this. But Scott, maybe you want to dive in on this.
Can I just one quick comment? So
Sure.
The public's perception can be changed, right? Let's look at the active surveillance. When it was first proposed, right, I think it was not very well accepted. Very few the patient opted for the active surveillance. But now look at the acceptance rate, right? For these low risk or very low risk patients, majority of the patients opt for the active surveillance. That was unimaginable maybe 20 years ago.
Well, we have an army. We have an army now.
Yeah, and I would put in a plug, the power of the patient advocacy groups, because I don't think I'm going to surprise anyone that the United States was really far behind in surveillance, and I would argue at least a part of it is our healthcare system is caked into it. The fee for service, and centers and individuals make money by doing things, and the patients in the United States in particular were the ones that stood up and as a voice said, along with some absolute pioneers like Bal Carter and Lori Klotz, said, you know what, we want surveillance, and pushed back against their physicians. And I think that, it's become a better landscape because of it. So I would you all have a really powerful voice, and inform yourself and be heard as you all are.
Now, Jim, what else you have on your agenda? And maybe we should call it quits at 1:45.
Okay, just a quick one, because I think it's an important point that bears reiteration. And frankly, I wanted to know whether the two speakers are in agreement on this. And the question is it accurate to say that true Gleason 6 does not metastasize?
I'll take it. The answer is unequivocally yes. There are a couple of case reports in the literature of people with metastatic prostate cancer where one of their many metastases matches their Gleason 6 in the prostate, but in their prostate, it's a little pebble of Gleason 6 surrounded by this ocean of Gleason 7, 8, or 9. When I say true or pure Gleason 6, what Dr. Zhou referred to is after you have the prostatectomy. If the only prostate cancer in your body is your Gleason 6, by definition, based on what we currently know, it can only be in your prostate. It literally can't go anywhere else in your body. True or false, Ming?
So that depends on whether you're looking at the radical prostatectomy or biopsies. So again, in radical, a Gleason 6 tumor is not cancer, and so it should not metastasize to lymph nodes or other distant organs. However, in the prostate biopsy, because of the issues of undersampling, undergrading, and the patient may still have a high grade cancer in his prostate gland. Therefore, I don't think that I can and I can label a Gleason score 6 cancer in the biopsy as non-cancer because of those the caveats.
But it's the same Gleason 6 you're seeing on the biopsy or the full prostate. You're making false distinctions. What you're arguing, and I absolutely agree with you, is a sampling issue. You know, you just have more thorough information once you have the whole prostate in your hand and under the microscope. So I think we're in agreement that it's just a sampling and diagnosis issue that we, you know, our biopsies should be as smart as possible. Try to identify that Gleason 7 or higher.
You know, I agree. So, you know, again, the Gleason grading is based on the morphology.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, based on the morphology, we know morphology is not very precise. I can show you, you know, I've showed you several pictures of the perineum invasion, the seminal vascular invasion, in which these cancer glands are well formed. Therefore, by strict the Gleason definition, they are Gleason 6, right? I can also show you some lymph node metastases. The cancer glands are well formed, but by strict definitions, you know, they are Gleason 6. But obviously, as you just mentioned, that in the prostate glands, you do see the higher grade cancer in the prostate gland. Okay, so the Gleason morphologically Gleason 6 cancer in these distant metastases or lymph nodes or the seminal vesicles, even though morphologically they are 6, but I think biologically and genetically they're very different from the true Gleason 6 cancer.
Well, let's see, Jim, any other burning questions in there?
Well, I think there's one that shows up in a couple spots. Does Gleason 3 sort of morph into Gleason 4 at some point? Or does it remain its form and Gleason 4 is a totally separately occurring sort of pathology?
If you read the studies, you have mixed results, right? Some studies have shown that Gleason, the 6 cancer is different from the Gleason pattern glands in a 3+4 cancer. Other studies show that the Gleason pattern 3 or Gleason 6 cancer can progress to higher grade. So it depends on which study you read.
Now I'm getting urgent messages that are asking if we can finish at the hour. Is that too much of an imposition, or is it just enough of an imposition?
So no problem with me.
Scott, the pressure's on you now.
I'm an hour ahead of Dr. Zhou, so how can I say no?
All right, so Jim,
I'm at home, Dr. Zhou, it's 9:45 and he looks like he's still at the office. So he's the MVP of sticking it if he wants to stick around.
Yeah, I can stay until 10.
Okay. So Jim, after, we're getting pressured to stay too. So I guess we're staying. Do you have some more questions there?
Yeah, I'm trying to scroll through these and come up with something. If you have something in the meantime, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to reintroduce Dr. Catalona to the mix. And maybe this is something that Dr. Zhou would go for. Dr. Catalona says that because of the well-recognized risk of biopsy sampling error, urologists remain justifiably concerned about the significant possibility of unrecognized undergrading. They see it frequently when Gleason 3+3 turns out to be Gleason 7 to 10. So he seems to be contradicting a lot of this discussion. But Dr. Zhou, you know, are you guys protecting your hindsides in the urology lab by sticking with the cancer diagnosis?
No, it is really not to protect the hindsight of our urologists. So again, and I made my argument based on the morphological and genetic features of the Gleason 6 cancer, and also the fact that the quite a few of Gleason 6 cancer diagnosed in prostate biopsies and can be graded upgraded to 7 and above. So for those reasons, I'm sticking to a cancer diagnosis, and I'm so happy that Dr. Eggener has not thrown pathologists under bus yet, because he has not brought up this issue of the misgrading by pathologists. But I do believe that's an issue that we have to address.
One of my co-conspirators in this big movement, a couple of them are actually pathologists. And we have some survey data that we'll publish. We're just seeing it. It's about 1,300 people from around the world, all prostate cancer experts. And a couple hundred are pathologists, and they answered a survey on, is Gleason 6 cancer? And the results are interesting. So
that's sort of a sly smile, Scott.
Yeah, it's, you know,
Yeah.
You'll see it at some point.
Yeah, I actually participated in that survey as well.
I know your answer on the survey.
I thought the information was confidential, or are you just basing this on the evidence tonight?
No, it's not complete yet, and we haven't done all the analyses, so I don't want to, get up over my skis before we have the, thorough analysis.
Well, Dr. Eggener, from the surveys, it sounds like you've changed a lot of minds this evening in this webinar, at least. Where does your effort to reclassify Gleason 6 stand? What's the landscape looking like?
Yeah, so I would tell you that there's this huge survey where we'll just kind of read the temperature of the room, and prostate cancer experts around the world. They've answered from about 5 different continents, and we're hoping to get 1,500 people from all the relevant specialties. There was a really exciting effort that was going to be funded by the CDC, the National Cancer Institute, and another federal agency to sponsor a conference to get all the thought leaders from all these specialties together and have a state of the science conference on basically, is Gleason 6 cancer? And mid-pandemic, I got a call from my point person at the CDC that because of funding issues, they have to postpone it. We're still going to try to make it happen with some other funding sources. And again, I just want a platform to force the conversation, and we'll see how it plays out. Another thing that Howard's aware of, we have a kind of an essay or opinion piece with 6 or 7 authors, all individually from the different key components. One's from the CDC, one's radiation, one's urology, one's pathology. Howard represents the patient advocacy group, and it's basically laying out the argument that I just made, and we're hoping to get it into a high impact journal where it gets a lot of eyeballs, and again, sparks the conversation. We'll see if someone will take it that'll achieve that. And so those are the big ticket items, and we'll see how it plays out. As any transformation in medicine over the history of time, it doesn't happen immediately. It happens typically slowly. You have to change hearts and minds, but like I've laid out to you, I think the data, the facts, the evidence really make a compelling argument.
Can I ask about some other changes that are afoot in, for patients like us? Got a question here about what do you see as the potential for liquid biopsies and liquid biomarkers in between biopsies? And I should mention we're going to have a speaker next Wednesday founder of the company Ming, which has developed the Seminole liquid biopsy, and Dr. Klotz is the medical director of that company. But anyway, what do you see as the potential for liquid biopsies in your ecology, in our ecology?
It's the holy grail, and every guy on this call that's had a biopsy, you and I and everyone else wish there was an easier way of knowing what you had in your prostate without doing a biopsy. The microRNA data from that company looks encouraging. I will tell you that the history of liquid biopsies in prostate cancer and elsewhere haven't panned out. I certainly hope the next one will be the one, but I would love nothing more than for it to be reality at some point. But there's a lot more studies that need to be done to prove that.
So, Ming, will the liquid biopsy, if that holy grail is found, will that put you out of business?
Well, no, certainly, that's one. Oh, and I don't think that will put pathologists out of the business, right? Remember, you need a pathologist to run these liquid biopsy testing labs. And you also need a pathologist to sort of integrate all these diagnostic information in a presentable format to clinicians like Dr. Eggener. So I don't think we will be out of a business, we'll be out of a job. Instead, I think we will be doing something different and more exciting. So I think that's what I tell my trainees, residents, and fellows. Right? They really need to look at getting additional trainings in molecular pathology and digital pathology, because that's the future of pathology.
One of the big discussions in groups, in this group and in other groups like this, is the transperineal versus the transrectal biopsy. And, Scott, you were talking about change, in terms of redefining Gleason 6. Well, I think we're starting to see change now as far as the type of biopsy that's done. And I wonder, what both of your perspectives are on transrectal versus transperineal. Does it make any difference on the product that the pathologist looks at? Does it make any difference, Scott, in, taking care of your patients?
There's two main advantages to transperineal. Number one, it basically eliminates the risk of an infection. And it does a better job of sampling a part of the prostate called the anterior prostate, which is further away from the rectum. It's typically a little bit more uncomfortable for the patient, a little bit more laborious for the urologist. And like many things, there was resistance to change. And, we like to think of ourselves in the US as pioneers and innovators and ahead of the curve. But for this in particular, our friends across the pond in Britain and in Australia led the charge in this and convinced the world that transperineal is the way to go. And we're doing it. It will eventually become the most common type of biopsy across the US, but we're not even close yet.
So which is going to happen first, reclassification or acceptance of transperineal as the way to go? That's rhetorical, I think. So, but Ming, does it make any difference to the pathologist whether the patient has a transrectal or transperineal biopsy? Is a biopsy just a biopsy in this case?
No difference for pathologists. A biopsy is a biopsy, and the cancer is still a cancer. It doesn't matter whether the biopsy is.
Well, you're getting in a cheap shot there, Ming. You thought we wouldn't catch on to that. Let me ask about one other technology, the micro ultrasound. Is this, are there advantages or disadvantages to this from the urologist point of view? And, do pathologists have any thoughts about this?
The data hasn't borne out. As everyone knows, there's a lot of things that sound great, should be great, intuitively, conceptually make a lot of sense. And some of those actually bear out with data and facts, and others don't. And in the here and now, there's really no convincing evidence on a large scale that micro ultrasound is on par with MRI or better. Now, that might change with time. I'm always willing to change my mind, but it's just not the case in the here and now, primarily because they haven't gone head to head versus MRI in a proper fashion or standard ultrasound, but maybe that'll be done at some point.
Yeah. Ming, any comment?
Well, it's nice you try to keep me engaged, but there's no difference for pathologists.
Okay. I think we're running close to the bewitching hour. Jim, if it's okay, I think do you have a last question?
Well, I've got just a couple. I think one is just a general question. Is there any good knowledge about the likelihood of 3+3 at biopsy turning out to be 3+4 at prostatectomy? I mean, what if somebody has got 3+3? What's their real risk of having 3+4, or is that just not possible to answer?
In the era, we do have very accurate answers to that, because for a decade or two, everyone with Gleason 6 got treated, and they all had a prostatectomy. And all comers with Gleason 6, if they go to surgery and you get their entire prostate, about 25% of them have Gleason 7 or higher. Okay. It's not that the Gleason 6 is reinterpreted or changed. It's just that the Gleason 7 wasn't sampled.
Wasn't picked up.
The biopsy.
Yeah. But now, as Dr. Eggener just mentioned, because of the MI targeted biopsies, that the rate of upgrading will be even lower.
So Jim, how about one last question? And
one question that just came in a little bit ago. I was diagnosed with prostate cancer Gleason 6 while on testosterone replacement therapy, and once diagnosed, many men in the TRT community don't know what to do. Is TRT safe after diagnosis?
Yeah, so one of the talks that I'm asked to give very often, that tends to be a popular talk amongst urologists, are 20 busted myths about prostate cancer, and things that we were all taught, at least my generation, that have turned out to not be based on any fact and have been busted myths. One of those is testosterone fuels prostate cancer, and all the data nowadays suggest if you're on testosterone supplementation for a good reason, and you supplement your testosterone levels to a normal level, 300, 400, 500, not 800, 900, 1,000, it has absolutely zero impact on your prostate cancer compared to a guy who has natural testosterone levels of 300, 400, 500. And it just makes, and there's data to support that, but it makes logical sense also. If your prostate has cancer in it and it's bathed in your blood and it has a concentration of testosterone of, say, 400, those cancer cells don't care if that 400 concentration is coming naturally or coming from a supplement. It's seeing what it's seeing. So I have no problem with guys continuing on testosterone supplementation as long as they have a real reason for being on it.
Well, listen, I want to thank both Drs. Eggener, Dr. Zhou, which is pronounced any way you want to pronounce it, by the way, depending on which part of China you think you're from.
You're right.
Anyway, correct. I want to thank you both for this tremendous program. We'll see what happens in the future. I don't know if either one of you want to make a bet on it, but you can do that between yourselves later. I want to turn the program now briefly over to Herb Geller, who's a fellow prostate cancer patient and a board member of AnCan. So Herb, you have some parting wisdom?
Well, I think we've all learned a lot tonight. I mean, these are very interesting questions. I mean, my own take on it is that the Gleason score is a very old pathological diagnostic criteria. And in order to take that diagnostic criteria to the clinic, you need other data. And I think, you know, what I would hope for is that we can decide on what data are going to be needed, and we may know it already, to say, all right, this pathological Gleason 6 is one that is really not a cancer, whereas this pathological Gleason 6 has the potential to be metastatic and cancerous. And I think, you know, I mean, I think it's been mentioned by Dr. Eggener that it's a sampling issue, right? When you go in and take a biopsy, you don't get the whole tissue, you get little cores, and who knows what you left behind. And the idea that 20% of those patients there with the Gleason 6 after you did the RP had some Gleason 7s, that does say something. But on the other hand, if we're now at the level of personal and, you know, the patient perspective, the idea that what you have is not cancerous could be really important in terms of both your perspective on life and how you treat yourself and how you go on with your life. So I think this is a very important issue, and I really appreciate the fact that we've had a chance to listen to it. I should also tell you that the AnCan is really excited about the idea that we can help promote active surveillance and maybe potentially decide who, you know, what the accurate terminology might be. And for you, Dr. Eggener, we'll be presenting a survey of AnCan members at the AUA meeting in Las Vegas. So hopefully we'll get to see you in person there and can discuss some of these issues. So I want to thank both of our speakers, Dr. Eggener, Dr. Zhou, for their presentations and for the audience for listening.
So with that, I guess it's adios. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everybody. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye now. Okay,
It is stopped now, and we're going to go to Barnescus.
Yeah,
Okay.
Rick is serving drinks. So.
Actually, I'm about to get myself a drink before I go into the Barniscus. I need one. Okay, see you in the Barniscus. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye.